Thank you for joining us for the last of 3 events that e-flux and I are organizing in parallel to the super community issue that e-flux Journal is publishing throughout the summer with the Venice Biennial. Tonight, I'm very happy to have Arnaud Gaspacher and Dominique Petman here for an evening on the relation between the increasing development of non-human animal studies, their culture, and even their rights, as for example, here in the state of New York with the Nonhuman Rights Project, personhood court cases on 3 chimps, Tommy, Hercules, and Leo. You probably heard about this story. That relation with the increasing presence of animals in contemporary art. But more precisely, I guess the question is it the case that contemporary art has begun to re-envision its understanding of animals and multi-species relations beyond taking them simply as subjects as materials, rather instead of subjects as life? And that, I think that's something that Arnaud will be speaking more about. On the other hand, another aspect that I think we'll be addressing tonight is this image of the animal perhaps as an instrumental image for the modern boundaries and frontiers between what is wild, civilized, what is rational and irrational, what is political and what is not political, obviously. But I would say also the blurring of the intelligence, culture, and subjectivity, or even simply the role of non-human animals in society, punctures our own modern naturalist ontology, and perhaps it reveals significant changes in its evolution, not necessarily towards animist, totemic, or analogical ontologies, to use anthropological terms, but perhaps also the evolution into some sort of different sociality. Other than that, I will just read very briefly a couple of bios. Arnaud Gaspacher is a PhD candidate in art history at the Graduate Center here in New York. His research focuses on the intersections between contemporary art, animal studies, philosophy, and ecological thought. He is currently writing his dissertations on non-human animals and post-humanist theory in French and Belgian art practices in the 70s and 80s. He has taught courses at Brooklyn College, York College, and MoMA. He's a regular contributor to Art Agenda here at e-flux and other art magazines. And he has been involved in a number of curatorial projects, including as a researcher for Being Singular Plural at the Guggenheim in 2012, and as co-curator of Unnatural Limits at the Austrian Cultural Forum here in New York in 2013. And Dominique Petman is a cultural theorist and author. He is the professor of culture and media at Eugene Lang College at the New School for Social Research. He has held different positions at the University of Melbourne, University of Geneva, and University of Amsterdam. His work combines cultural studies, media studies, philosophical approaches on topics from new media, popular culture, affect theory, technology, and animal studies. He's the author of After the Orgy, Towards a Politics of Exhaustion, Love and Other Technologies, Retrofitting Arrows for the Information Age, Human Error, Species Being, and Media Machines, which is published by in the Post-Humanities series from Minnesota Press. And more recently, Look at the Bunny, Totem, Taboo, and Technology, and his more fictional work, Indivisible Cities. So thank you so much, and we'll start.
Is it possible just to turn down the lights slightly for the PowerPoint? Thank you. So I want to thank Pedro for inviting me. e-flux. That's a cursed word somehow. e-flux. And all of you for coming out and listening. I won't start with a big preamble to save time, and I'll try not to make too many asides, otherwise I'll end up going too long. So I'll just dive right into it. In Kant after Duchamp, Thierry Dedeuve makes use of a hypothetical scenario to elicit the nominative power of art as teased out by the ready-made. He asks you to imagine yourself an alien anthropologist doing field research on Earth. Your lack of human prejudice would allow you to observe human customs and rituals in the hopes of uncovering an intelligible social order. But then Dedeuve posits a crucial blind spot. He says you'd quickly notice, among other things, and keep those words in mind, among other things, that in most human tongues, there's a word whose meaning escapes you and whose usage varies considerably among humans, but which, in all their societies, seems to refer to an activity that's either integrative or compensatory, lying midway between their myths and their sciences. And this word is art. This word is art. And certainly the way some objects, like urinals, are valorized in some human context, while relegated to the splashing of bodily fluids in others, might certainly be confounding. It might take a while to figure all this out. Dedeuve's scenario, however, begs the following question. Isn't this alien anthropologist an oxymoronic construction, in that it entails a non-alien anthropologist? He also suggests ethnographer, but this doesn't prove to be any less logically dissonant. Since the alien is neither studying his own kind nor an othered variant, but beings that are ostensibly equally alien, what Dedeuve really describes is an alien ethologist. The human would be a strange animal to the extraterrestrial, and this is the best analogy we have on hand in describing this meeting place between species alien and species human. Though ultimately even the word ethologist proves to be inadequate. Even using the word species is a stretch, not to mention the gendered pronoun he. The fact that the history of anthropology and ethnography have been thinly veiled ethologies shows the great difficulty we have in separating these categories. It also shows how difficult it is for us to envision forms of intelligent life beyond ethological limits. And this is why so many examples of alien life in science fiction films tap into pre-existing animal morphologies. So I could have given you any number of examples, but the one I really like would be District 9, a somewhat recent film, where you had aliens that were nicknamed prawns for various obvious reasons here. And they basically became asylum seekers. But what's really important and interesting was the publicity campaign, a viral campaign, that came right before the film, which basically enacted and played out on message boards, but also live in public, kind of a battle between a corporation that's for the apartheid of these prawns and then one that supports their rights. And so then the ones who are supporting their rights, they're equally, this is equally racially tinged, but of course this doesn't make sense without context of non-human rights. So maybe 30 years ago, something like this would have been impossible as a viral campaign, but today it makes a lot of sense to us. But leaving aside this problematic in Dedeuve's scenario, there's another begged question. What are these among other things besides art thrown in as hedge? If you could brush aside the more immediate events animating the social order, then your kind has already been schooled in a modernist form of connoisseurship. More likely, as this alien, you'd begin your field research not on the paradoxical treatment of inert objects. Instead, you'd probably be struck first and foremost by the paradoxical relations among the living subjects, those that move around each other, since you too would presumably be a living subject. And if living or subject are not already too metaphorical, then through your eyes in ambulation, you'd observe a slew of beings who also have eyes in ambulation. Your comparative method might even trouble you, since some of these beings treat each other with extreme violence. You might even start worrying for your own safety. And although you might not know any earthly word for violence, you would have an embodied, intuitively derived concept of violence as something to avoid for oneself, even if, and this is really crucial, even if your alien physiology made it impossible for you to communicate this concept through a voice as speech. Moreover, since your alien subject formation would not be informed by the humanist history of violence, with all its biases against certain humans and nearly all non-humans, you'd be unprejudiced enough to see the logically dissonant relations between these sentient beings not unlike yourself. You'd find a minority of humans and non-humans living in pampered spaces, and a vast majority of other humans and non-humans living in infernal spaces. In other words, you'd be in position not only to uncover the confusing discursivity of what makes art art, but more urgently, you'd be a biopolitical researcher uncovering the ready-made markers of exaltation on one side and debasement on the other. I've just used the word ready-made really broadly as something generally already formed or ready at hand. This too Dedeuve's writings address when he describes the eventual reception of the historical ready-made as the n'importe quoi, the anything whatsoever, or as the thoroughgoing deregulation of the rules of art. What's increasingly clear in recent contemporary art, and really going back as far as the late 60s, is that non-human animals have been caught up in this process of deregulation, for better and for worse. In the following, I want to return to the historical tenor of Duchamp's strategy and play it off the historicity of animals. The example I refer to throughout is Marcel Brutaille's Les Animaux de la Ferme from 1974, and from here on out, for brevity, I'm just going to say Les Animaux. This print says almost everything I'd like to say about the animal ready-made, and it embodies three key facets of the historical ready-made. One, its relationship to naming, nominalism, and the force of institutional language and law. Two, its relationship to subject formation as a result of these discursive powers. And three, its relationship to industrial objects and endlessly repeatable processes and things, which form the basis of modern industry. So the power of naming, the subjecthood this gives rise to, and the industrial repeatability of things. At first blush, Les Animaux is pure simplicity of image and text. Its encyclopedic aesthetics taps into a long history of humanist enlightenment, laying bare a taxonomic procedure of naming and ordering. And yet, as Foucault already demonstrates in a classic text, humanism came to the Enlightenment with some personal baggage. It arrived with dogmatic presuppositions about itself. One of these is man's anthropocentric position in the world, with his self-authorized rights of intelligence, morality, and emotion. Naturally, this gave man the power to name and order the world in ecological sovereignty. In the case of animals, however, their common names came ready-made from a pre-enlightened worldview, one that nevertheless folded itself seamlessly into a modern scientific discourse. For in truth, in the West at least, the received way of naming animals, of calling them in order to order them, has roots that go much further back. In effect, Les Animaux is fed by a Judeo-Christian story. Here we might recall Derrida's text, The Animal That Therefore I Am, and one of its opening moves. By now, the opening scene is well known. Derrida feels shame in appearing naked in the morning with his cat looking on. We see him being seen by an animal, something he says no philosopher had ever avowed before. In analyzing this non-human gaze, Derrida recalls the primal scene of naming in the biblical narrative of Genesis. One of the features of this narrative that interests him most is the gap of time between the creation of the animals, the creation of Adam, and Adam being given the right to name the animals. In effect, during this abyssal gap, the animals existed before they were animals, before they were seen and called animals. It's difficult to find a visual analog of this in art history, and even the normally daring Michelangelo skips over it on the Sistine ceiling. But Hieronymus Bosch comes close on the panel doors of the Garden of Earthly Delights. This is the Garden of Earthly Delights closed, less famous. We can make out God on a cloud up on the top left, resting after his third day's work, maybe already thinking about the next 2 days to come, leading to the animals, and eventually to Adam on day 6. And so every time Derrida communed with his cat in the morning, he saw a creature that refers, in its mute present, maybe mute, back to an ancestral form of life predating human divine naming. And though deconstruction often gets pigeonholed as mired in textuality, when considering this scene, Derrida almost sounds like a speculative realist by asking this deceivingly simple question: who was born first, before the names? What's amazingly weird about Genesis, counter to the creationist creed, is that it affirms at least one essential feature of Darwin's theory of evolution. In both cases, the non-human precedes the human, albeit by very different causes and temporalities. In both cases, we hope to gain access to a pre-human moment of non-human precedence. An old-school structuralist might even plausibly read the fifth day as a mythopoetic precursor to the origin of species. There's also a peculiar affinity between biblical naming and zoological taxonomy. Here's a clear instance where pre-modern settings folded themselves into modernist humanist disciplines. To be more specific, in each case, be it the pre-modern or the modern, the animal is reduced to a type, either safeguarded by the twos on a floating ark or housed in a laboratory or factory farm by the billions. Both Genesis and humanism present the human as inimitable, as an atom of one sort or another, if you're born in the right place, the right time, the right type of human, while relegating non-human animals to typology. In theory, both present an ideal of man as singular, from which laws and rights are based, while animals are reduced to a metonymic chain of facsimiles. And Brutire's print certainly plays into this typological history of animal representation. For here we have perfectly groomed cows, all in a docile row, each profiling their kind. Today, animal studies and cognitive ethologists have begun to denaturalize this long-standing Neoplatonic history of animals as fixed and named types. Yet well before, the surrealists had already begun scrambling these codes. Magritte is exemplary here. In a gesture at once post-Genesis and post-humanist, Magritte peels away the epistemological adhesive that heretofore had stood fast between animals and language. In an illustrated text, Words and Images, on the left there, the natural correlation between a horse, the image of a horse, and the word horse is destabilized in a profane illumination of semiotic custom. Or, as he puts it in the caption, an object is never simply in the service of its name or image. This tactic he often puts to good use in his paintings. For example, the interpretation of dreams on the right here, where a horse is arbitrarily recaptured as a door. In the portrait from 1935, a piece of ham on a plate is disconcertingly re-ocularized to stare back at the viewer/gourmand through an eye that, if you've ever met a pig up close, could either be porcine or human. And I like to think that this offers a painterly parallel to the more famous bovine eye, used as sacrificial surrogate in Buñuel and Dali's Andalusian Dog. And finally, in his painting, The Red Model, Magritte describes in part this painting as depicting the monstrous custom of slipping human skin into non-human skin, as living epidermis morphing into dead organ leather. Destabilizing of customs and of language go hand in hand for the surrealist painter. We know that Brutire's was influenced by Magritte's practice, and as you may have already noted from the PowerPoint, Les Animaux employs a similar device. Instead of types of cows, the names printed underneath are models of cars: Chevrolet, Cadillac, Chrysler, Maserati, and so on. Yet while Magritte's practice plays off the arbitrary relationship of signifiers and signifieds, one has to turn to the ready-made in order to uncover how this arbitrariness sticks, how it solidifies into custom. As it's often read, Duchamp's fountain forced the institutional power of nominating something as art out of the shadows. Crucially, this nominal power is more than a surface effect. Its discursive potency strikes deep into the heart of the object it calls and frames. So much so that an object that formerly had no aura and no uniqueness can become transubstantiated as an irreplaceable object, or one only reproducible through authorized editions in the market. Yet this nominative power may have the opposite ontological effect, which might be more interesting, what we might call the ready-made in reverse. Where once an object was unique and individual, certain ready-made tropes can make it appear as purely exchangeable and expendable. So in a provocative reading, this means that the ready-made in reverse would not bring out the exalting power of art out of the shadows, but the debasing power of categorical discrimination instead, be it race, gender, class, or species. They all look alike is a familiar enough refrain. Now I turn to the second feature of the historical ready-made, namely how it relates to subject formation. In her essay, Ready-Made Originals, Molly Nesbitt traces Duchamp's choices for his objects back to the schoolroom. From coffee grinders to snow shovels, the proto-ready-mades for Duchamp's breakthrough can be found in the pedagogic curriculum implemented by the French school system in the 19th century. And here you're seeing an example of one of them. Nesbitt traces these original ready-mades in still extant student notebooks, which include exercises for practicing basic drawing skills, especially those that lend themselves to industrial uses and modern designs. So again, here you have an advance of a broken arm by Duchamp, and then an example of one of these school books that would have been used to practice and teach drawing. Brutire's Les Animaux de la Ferme, Les Animaux, has similar pedagogic beginnings. Technically, the print is a ready-made assisted, whose original source material came from the publisher Maison d'Érol, which was founded in 1831 as a naturalist shop in Paris and became a publishing house of pedagogic materials. So on the left there, you don't see it very often, but this is the original print that Brutires would have detooled, he would have used. And then there are others that are similar format. Of course, these are equine. These are the horse version. A recent activity book for children by the same publisher, which includes a reprinting of the original Les Animaux de la Ferme, notes in its preface that these plates have taught generations of French students lessons in zoology, botany, and anatomy. In this new edition, there's even added textual information telling the student how many liters of milk these cows can produce, how selective breeding has enhanced certain qualities of production, and how each cow typifies its French region. In the same way that Duchamp's ready-made originals attest to an institutional shaping of common sense, Brutires' print keys in on a similar, yet more ideologically elusive moment of a child's subject formation, namely, her inurement to a purportedly natural instrumentalization of non-human animals and their biological processes. It's been little noted, but Brutires' engagement with animals, however enigmatic, is prolific. There's his recurring fascination with La Fontaine's fables, another staple of the French classroom. There are his pre-visual art books of poetry, including La Bête Noire and more famously Pense Bête. In one of the latter's lesser-known poems, titled Pork, Brutires integrates the names of cuts of porcine meat as some sort of carnist prose, and ends the poem addressing the pig directly with the following phrase: "I read in your little eyes a children's book." This poem could be a fitting textual analog to Magritte's cut of ham staring back at you from your plate's surface. It also attests to Brutires' fascination with pedagogic materials for children and the role non-humans play in these materials. As Nesbitt tells us, the most basic lesson taught to young French students was how to draw straight lines and curved lines, which, not so incidentally, make up the first letters of the alphabet. If one follows the work of Brutires and compares old lesson books for teaching the alphabet, one invariably finds animals accompanying the letters, often simply A, B, and C. It's as if there's a natural correlation between animals and letters, at once morphological, typographical, and typological. So on the left, you have a work by Brutires. There are many examples I could give, but clearly have his use of the first three letters there, and he's taken a shrimp and changed it into the letters themselves. And another children's game using letters and animals on the bottom there from the same book. And then this one, I love all these old 19th century pedagogic books for children, teaching French students, French kids, the alphabet. And you'd always have an animal as a mnemonic device in order to learn the alphabet. And what I especially love about this cover, if you can see the word les animaux, you actually have animals that are kind of stretched out and make up the letters themselves. Which is a really nice touch, conjoining letters and animals together. I'm using these examples to determine a greater truth about subject formation that seamlessly incorporates the animal body, sometimes quite literally. It's as if alphabetic phonetic speech and non-human animals are conjoined on the tip of the tongue in a subtle display of carnophalangocentric power, a power that asserts itself much more fully once the child becomes inured to the sacrificial demands of adulthood. Diderot's literature sausage, we're seeing a couple here, in which he uses traditional recipes for sausages, though he substitutes printed matter for the animals, for the meat, which sometimes includes Marx and Hegel, illustrates this carnophalangocentric power quite nicely, of the convergence between the mastication of flesh and the potency of words, of incorporating bodies of work along with the bodies of animals. Eat your dinner, eat your words. Eventually, after mastering her ABCs, a student will graduate to Marx and Hegel with a lot of chewing, mulling, and possibly indigestion in the process. In these scenarios of subject formation, there's a feedback loop. The child is formed through an institutional pedagogic discourse, which feeds the necessary bodies and minds to fill political positions, everyday life, and commodity culture, its self-understandings, and ideological. This institutional pedagogic discourse, however, gets its authorization and power from previous human bodies and minds that have already social positions. Clearly, there's a problem with origins here. In Lacan, this would be the origins of the big other, something I certainly won't be solving in this talk. What I'm emphasizing more simply is that the subject formation of the human implicates the epistemological formation of the non-human. the conceptual forming and molding of animality, which is both generated and reinforced by the socio-eco-political feedback loop, has serious effects on the way non-humans are integrated into humanist knowledge and history. In a quote that gathers together the power of naming and this institutional feedback loop, Derrida says the following: "The animal is a word. It's an appellation that men have instituted, a name they've given themselves the right and the authority to give the living other. Note how both human and non-human are shaped by this power. Note the logocentric power imbalance, giving the human agency. Note also how well this sentence might work to describe the strategy of the ready-made, should the word art be substituted for the word animal, and the words any object for living other. The resulting sentence would read, art is a word. It's an appellation that men have instituted, a name they've given themselves the right and authority to give any object." In recent posthumanist theory, notably Kerry Wolf's integrative reading of systems theory and deconstruction, this sui generis formation is described as autopoiesis. And autopoiesis, in the most general sense, is something that arises out of itself, a type of self-organization, self-generation. In the broadest sense, the history of humanism has been one big autopoietic formation leading to the consolidation of the humanist subject. The neoliberal self-made man takes this process to the extreme. The human institutes and calls himself sovereign in relation to certain humans and all non-humans. He informs himself, he assumes himself, and most crucially, so that this autoreferential construction remains uncontaminated, any inhuman or non-human affinities are disavowed, dissimulated, discarded, repressed, or violently subordinated. Uncannily, Brutheijer's work may allude to all this as well. Recall his famous use of muscles, which could serve as metaphorical creatures for the autopoietic humanist. In his exhibition, Moule à Frites, in one poem, My Rhetoric, the self-professed king of muscles seems to parody the Cartesian cogito. Me, I say I say I tautologize, I conserve, I sociologue. And in his most famous poem from Pense Bête, Brutheijer describes the mollusk as having craftily avoided the mold of society, that it formed itself out of itself and achieved perfection, words that might fittingly describe the phantasmatic yet powerful humanist subject. Yet there's another way of understanding autopoiesis in more ontological or phenomenological terms. While autopoiesis as a discursive formation is by and large anthropocentric, this other form of autopoiesis can be described as an organism's self-generating ability to bring forth a world. Unlike discursive autopoiesis, this embodied function is patently shared by both human and non-human animals alike. This version also contests the first. The human cogito thinks through phonetic alphabetic speech. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am human. I am human because I am what thinking and the human is. And slowly but surely falls prey to a circular, self-referential conception of consciousness as reducible to speech. Most non-human animals are phonetically challenged, which has caused them a lot of problems in history. Nevertheless, they are autopoietic in other ways. They do bring forth the world in auto-affective processes. Derrida rewrites the cogito to account for this non-human autopoiesis. When describing the cognitive being of an octopus and his desire to gently hold one so that it might emit some inky traces in the water, Derrida asserts that its ink or power would here be the I, not necessarily the power to say I, but the ipseity of being able to be I, or able to do I, even before any autoreferential utterance in language. So cogito not as identical to speech, but cogito as attested to by bodily interiority, traces, and gestures that demonstrate to varying degrees of clarity, to varying degrees of proximity to the anthro, an ability to be or do I. More recently, Brian Masumi, in What Animals Teach Us About Politics, devotes an opening passage to the development of non-human signification. In a lovely example, he analyzes the difference between real fighting and play fighting among dogs as the very archae-semiotic conditions of language and intersubjectivity. A light nip means amiability and friendship, while drawing blood means antagonism and war. In essence, Masumi offers an evolutionary account of non-human shared meanings and concepts before the humanist will come along and claim them for himself as purely reducible to speech acts. This realization is an embarrassment for the humanist. Any non-human origins, not only of language, but of sexuality, conviviality, empathy, and so much else, gets disavowed by what Agamben has called the anthropological machine, which desperately tries to keep the human wheat from animal chaff. Having spoken about the power of naming and its role in subject formation, I now turn to the third and last, and probably the darkest feature of Les Animaux, namely the relationship between industrial repeatability and non-human animals. Brutaille's substitution of automobile models for names of cows is not only a surrealist scrambling of codes. In fact, this substitution alerts us to the long history of the modern Fordist assembly line. In the animal studies literature, this genealogy is well known. Henry Ford's inspiration for his assembly line found its impetus in a Chicago slaughterhouse, which already by the 19th century had developed the mechanization of mass disassembly of animal bodies. So one of the texts is Gideon's mechanism takes command, which these images are from, and they're actually not the Chicago slaughterhouses. They come a little before in Cincinnati. They're the pork packing plants. But they show you the assembly-disassembly logic is already in place in the 19th century. In Animal Capital, Nicole Shukin even offers a compellingly conjoined material history between slaughterhouses, automobiles, and film. Not only was gelatin, rendered from animal bodies, a precondition for the making of celluloid, but the desire for a moving spectacle can be traced back to the on-site public tours of slaughterhouses given by the companies themselves for publicity. This is largely unthinkable today, though it still does happen in some versions. And demonstrates the historicity of inurement vis-a-vis violence towards non-humans is highly disjunctive. Even then, however, these companies understood they had a delicate balancing act to perform between the flesh, screams, and effective responses of humans and non-humans on one side, and the profit margin in hopes to maximize the sale of the resulting meat on the other. Shukin analyzes the tour books handed out after the tours, but crucially just before the gift shop, which blunts and naturalizes this violence by a narrative mediator in the form of a child. So these are a couple of the images from the tour guide where you have a little girl telling her parents about all the processes in the slaughterhouse. Now pedagogy is reversed. For it's the child who informs the adult. If this little girl can handle it next to a carcass, then so can you, and all is well. But of course, behind this dissimulating reversal of the child-adult relationship are yet other adults behind the scenes, madmen, if you will, whose rhetoric offers comfort for the flow of bodies, capital, and spectacle. In art history, the increased mechanization of the slaughterhouse is not without its detractors, though for reasons that have more to do with aesthetics than with ethics. Bataille's 1929 commentary in Document on Eli Lotar's photographs of a Parisian slaughterhouse already draws attention to this changing role of the animal in modern economics. Ever unwilling to let go of sacrifice as a social staple, Bataille laments the end of ritualistic traditions involving the animal, its orgiastic blood flow, and the meaning of its death within the structural fabric of culture. His nostalgia is redirected towards a critique of the meaninglessness of modern slaughter. He deplores the aseptic conditions of modern production, which turn once meaningful killing into a pathological site to be disavowed and quarantined like a plague-ridden ship. This creates the conditions for a modern subject whose increasingly distant relation with slaughter and sacrifice leads to boredom and an unhealthy need for cleanliness. Once this subject takes over the city, Bataille describes a modern populace with the collective vitalism of mere vegetables. Certainly he goes too far in saying that slaughter has become bloodless, as any animal activist could tell you today. Certainly not the case. But nonetheless, Bataille does account for an immunological paradigm in animal production that's taken hold to a frightening degree and scale today. Lotar's photographs in Document bear out Bataille's history of a desacrificial economy. On the one hand, the bloody aspect of the slaughterhouse remains. In one photograph, on the left, a slab of animal flesh seems to be sliding along the stone floor in its own blood like a large pad of furry butter. This is the chaotic aspect of the slaughtering that Bataille seems to be pining for. On the other hand, another photograph, the one on the right, shows a courtyard outside the slaughterhouse. On a wall scrawled with graffiti, the workers have propped up the mostly inedible, yet still useful, remains of cow hooves and ankles side by side, one after the other. Unlike the blood-soaked scene of the other photograph, here the serialized aesthetic of modernity reigns. There's no blood and nothing's out of joint. This aberration reads like a formal stain in the composition, for in all other respects, the antisepticness of modernity is on the cusp of complete victory. This photograph conditions the viewer away from what should be inimitable forms of life into serialized objects that can be endlessly reproduced and lined up in a row. In other words, into animal ready-mades. And every time I go to Moment at Work in the education department, I feel like Warhol's taken this to its natural conclusion with his cow wallpaper. If Bataille were writing today, he'd likely be one with the locavores, fixated on backyard slaughter and their omnivorousness, which they dubiously nominate a dilemma. He might even be a paleo, that equally dubious primitivist fantasy. I'd argue so would Heidegger, who might say that time-worn agrarian techniques bring forth and reveal the truths of human and non-human being, while industrial agribusiness reveals modern technology as a pernicious form of standing reserve. As it stands, Heidegger's concept of standing reserve has proved quite prescient for us. From his technology essay, he describes it as follows. The revealing that rules in modern technology is a challenging, and challenging is the key word here, which puts to nature the unreasonable demand that it supply energy which can be extracted and stored as such. By challenging, he means overtasking its capabilities, which today reads as a harbinger of the Anthropocene. Ultimately, the end game is the planet itself in standing reserve, including all its inhabitants, which this HSBC I always seem to see in the Paris Charles de Gaulle airport makes unwittingly clear. And just note the text under this, any salmon whatsoever, under this barcoded salmon, it says, in tomorrow's global economy, every resource will be counted. Animals, as mass extinction, as, in part, the ancestral prerequisite for fossil fuels, and especially in industrial production, which amounts to a large portion of annual greenhouse emissions, play a central role in the Anthropocene. And we should be calling on our cultural and educational institutions not only to divest from fossil fuels, but also from big ag, no more catering to or from the animal-industrial complex. The artist Mishta Henner has documented some of these big feedlots, which are both beautiful and terrifying. So here's Mishka Henner's, it seems to be cut off, but all these little dots are all individual animals, individual cows, and on the right here, you see the waste, and it's very strangely beautiful. Yet this form of standing reserve of Heidegger's concept also happens at the level of individual bodies, of challenging the capacity for bearing more and more milk, bearing more and more flesh that develops more and more quickly, time and fluids being capital, using antibiotics and hormones for certain biological outcomes, genetically predisposing a more profitable fertilization of twins or triplets, and various other garish experiments in gene technology, and the list could go on. When reading this image, I can't help but interpret the history of non-human domestication as an immunitary social function gradually turning autoimmune. In other words, that the manipulation of nature, including animals, once a key feature of human thriving, ethical or not, has today quite plainly backfired in an autoimmune mess. Having analyzed Brutaille's print in relation to a description of the historical ready-made, it becomes clear that terminal paradoxes, or at least inconsistencies, prevail. For in all three cases, the ready-made as nominal power, as subject formation, and as repeatable industrial object, when it comes to the animal, there's a surplus, something that exceeds all three parameters. This surplus, which today can only disingenuously be ignored, is nothing less than an auto-effective singularity within a self-aware ecology. This does not mean that animal singularities cannot make up a pack, but let's not fetishize this too much. This, more than anything, is what makes humans and so many non-human animals closely aligned. Contra the more severe theoretical strains of flat ontology, we indeed do have to make a cut in the real, which, depending on the case in point, will be more or less difficult. But whether or not this cut draws blood should be a key consideration. The major digital moment of how we understand singular life would be as follows. There are those forms of being who know themselves to be in the real and imperiled by it. And then there are forms of being that are simply a part of the real, without knowing auto-effectively that their substantial integrity matters, though it may matter, just not really to them. We could call this a post-humanist update of the Sartrean distinction between the for itself and the in itself. And this is another reason why Brutaille's recurring muscle is such a fascinating choice, because more than most, it's the animal that straddled the line of animal, vegetable, mineral. It's through this cut of understanding subjects of life whose life matters to them that we have self-reflexivity and singularity, and they can no longer be scrapped for an identical model once he or she moves through a personal ecology of time, space, memory, and sentience. And so this is not anthropocentric, but it is sentiocentric or limbic-centric. This is our most compelling basis for making ethico-political decisions. I should stress, however, that while this digital cut in the real is imperative for such decision-making, this doesn't mean that other domains of knowledge are not free to speculate on different ontologies and processes far beyond human-animal ontologies. These are often fascinating. Nonetheless, this ethico-political decision that binds together human and non-human animals, often in common dependency, should never be suspended, even if it can never be cut and dry, and even if it doesn't apply fully out in the wild, if during the Anthropocene such a state still exists. In order to sum up what I've tried to do here, I'll propose the following equation. The historical ready-made, as an artistic strategy, took a reproducible object and named it art. This was a provocation that challenged the dogmas of institutional power and display, since the object was neither made by the artist, nor was it unique. As for the animal ready-made, we have the inverse scenario. It's the ready-made in reverse. As a non-repeatable and non-reproducible subject, any singular animal used as an object for art can never be replaced in identity. After all, even a cloned pet will not be him or herself, even if genetically identical. Another way to say the same thing, a ready-made can never be sacrificed, since you would not be offering up an irreversible loss of uniqueness. This is why turkeys get pardoned every year, but urinals don't. Or, to put it more enigmatically, the ready-made can never have a memory. This does not mean that non-human animals cannot be consensual performers somehow in art or in cultural productions, but it does mean that he, she, or maybe it can never be a ready-made, even and especially when the artist buys it, living or dead. This undercutting of the ready-made logic is thematized by Jeffrey Valance's humorous, though ultimately serious project, Blinky the Friendly Hen. The artist went to a grocery store, picked out a chicken body from the pile, then named it Blinky. He then bought a plot for the carcass, or rather now corpse, and ultimately laid it to rest as one would any loved one in the Los Angeles pet cemetery. It's not that this gesture retroactively makes the bird a singularity through nomination, through naming and ceremony, as if the ready-made's power had that kind of ontological reach. It strikes deep in the heart of ontology, but not that deep. Instead, alive and well before his or her posthumous performance, the bird was really existing and inimitable, no matter how hard this is to imagine in store. Chickens and all sorts of non-humans can know and be called by proper names, have facial recognition of each other and of humans, and have all sorts of non-human ways of being that are peculiar to them, making use of memory and emotional systems. But of course, for the course of world history and the functioning of the market, this inimitable bird, Blinky, matters very little. Because of this, he or she, it's unclear, becomes emblematic of any instance of self-aware yet inconsequential form of life, human and non-human, who is equally disregarded as expendable, sacrificable, or theoretically subsumed as mere bare life. For what's ultimately nauseating about animal production is not only the needless suffering, violence, and death, but the thought, increasingly verified by ethological research, that these masses of non-humans have varying degrees of singular self-consciousness. Certainly, an animal can be disingenuously forced into a shell of repeatability, as industrial techniques and marketing have done through dissimulation and simulacra. But at its core, in the real and in theory, the animal ready-made is an impossibility. In the end, there's a dissymmetry between the historical ready-made and the animal ready-made, and I'm not sure the art world has recognized this just yet. What we need to do going forward, above all, is de-ghettoize the questions surrounding animals. This is not some weepy discourse at the margins. Rather, it's in common with the struggle against what Marx called general equivalence. Benjamin would take up this notion in his essay on mechanical reproduction, and he anticipates Brutiers' muscle and the animal ready-made when he writes, "To pry an object from its shell, to destroy its aura, is the mark of a perception whose sense of universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts it even from a unique object by means of reproduction." But as Jean-Luc Nancy says in his recent short text on the Fukushima disaster, equality is not equivalence. Instead, he argues for a dignity of singularity as a way of pushing back against this general equivalence, which today has taken hold of the whole planet, its humans and non-humans, its victims, its catastrophes, its meanings, and its values. If we follow through and accord this dignity of singularity to animals, in all respects within our means to do so, and we usually always have more than we think, my hope is that it would prove to be contagious for resisting other forms of violence, for solidarity with other unfashionable or unprofitable causes, of a compassion without reward, something our institutions and markets desperately need. Thanks very much.
So this talk is called The Screech Within Speech, Interspecies Imitation and the Creaturely Voice. So I'm going to be talking more about the oral world. But just to frame it a little bit, subjectivity was one of the key terms I was given, and it's always a vexed question of what is the criteria for such. Self-awareness, capacity for reason, language, abstraction, symbolic thought, etc. And then, as Arnaud mentioned, ethology is expanding the circle of self-reflexive animals every day. And it's clearer and clearer that we're no longer the exception that proves the rule. So Jeremy Bentham is credited with being the first to change the question by asking, can animals suffer? He wasn't by any means the only one at the time, but he's the one we associate with that question against Descartes' infamous bête machine, the animal does not suffer because it has no soul. So subjectivity can be assumed when something expresses suffering, and so suffering is linked to its expression. Since how would we know if something is suffering if it does not show signs of suffering? Not all creatures are the English upper class or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in New England. So expression, of course, is a key word for theories of art and art making. So there's a spectrum here I'm going to be addressing, at least implicitly, when it comes to the capacity to suffer on the one hand and the ability or compulsion to make art on the other. Anyway, I'm going to start with whales. One of the more compelling cult figures circulating in the popular imaginary at present has been described as the loneliest whale in the world. Some of you may have heard of it. This singular cetacean of unidentified species is so called because his call is registered at the unusual frequency of 52 hertz, which is much higher than all other types of whales. And we know the gender of this whale because only males make the distinct calling sound, presumably for amorous purposes, although probably for other social reasons as well. Scientists have tracked this mournful creature for several years, intrigued by the melancholy songs which go unanswered. From a whimsical perspective, this whale is an outsider artist offering personalized songs to the subaquatic world, only to be snubbed by the more vocal members of the whale community. Songs of the humpback, for instance, can, quote, sweep across the Pacific in just a few years, as biologists from the University of Queensland explain. Quote, in any given year, all the males in a population sing the same song, but the songs change from year to year. The changes are more than incremental. They represent whole new repertoires, end quote. Which is to say, the level and rate of change is unparalleled in any other non-human animal and thus involves culturally driven change at a vast scale. As a consequence, we may technically be able to assemble a whale hit parade, and indeed, marine scientists are presumably engaged in doing exactly that, albeit under different name or metaphor. Lonely whales notwithstanding, the larger and more sonically expressive cetaceans could arguably be considered the first instance of global communication, many millions of years ago, since their calls could travel up to astonishing distances, about 500 miles underwater, before our machines only recently created significant and today inescapable noise pollution. These days, whales have been forced into relatively tiny sonic boxes because of the din created by ship engines and various audio probings of the marine environment by military and industrial alike. As Christopher Clark, a scientist in the bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I don't know why it's ornithology, but anyway, suggests this sudden assault and subsequent diminishment of the whale's soundscape must be extremely traumatic for the animal whose overall Umwelt environment has shrunk from large swathes of the watery planet to barely a mile or so in any given direction. The noisier the ocean becomes, thanks to the general cacophony of the Anthropocene, the lonelier whales are likely to become, even if they sing in the frequency of the cetacean mainstream. Can we really, however, speak of singing in such cases? Is this not a romantic projection, an unscientific anthropomorphism, or an instance of the pathetic fallacy? Many would argue that simply using the organ of vocalization does not equate to singing in the sense we apply to ourselves, since the operation, when attempted by a non-human, lacks the element of self-reflection necessary for true expression, for artistry. Others have conversely argued that humans were likely taught to sing by other creatures, especially the birds, of course. According to this view, our songs are all the poorer for being filtered through human self-consciousness, thus diluting the purity of an unalienated ecological harmony. Philip Brophy, for instance, believes that, quote, the voice is corrupted by being human. These contrasting perspectives on the question of interspecies voice have a long and complex history, crisscrossing epochs, as well as those divergent orientations to the natural world, crudely divided into East and West. Some, such as Aristotle in ancient times and the third Earl of Shaftesbury in early modernity, argued that animals have voice, but not speech. Others, as Descartes already mentioned, would deny voice at all to non-humans, arguing instead that they merely emit sounds as a bicycle horn might if stepped on. Who or what can rightly claim to have a voice? Is it a property or capacity that belongs to a subject, even a non-human subject? Or might the voice be located somewhere between the shadows of the world and the ear of the listener? Might we even consider voice to include non-subjective expression of the elements themselves, the voice of the wind, the voice of the ocean? Might vox mundi, the voice of the world? Such questions deserve long and careful consideration, but for today, I'm going to be looking at the contested existence of the creaturely voice, one which describes a plurality of vocal expressions distributed amongst those species blessed with the capacity to make sounds with their bodies. As Tobias Minelli explains in a smart new book, the creaturely voice, like the human one, forms the vector of connection or sympathy and is thus suspended between the sonic producing subject and the auditory other. It is the creaturely voice which insists that, quote, we already inhabit a world in which we are subject to the claims of other expressive creatures. Via such incarnations of the voice of nature, we hear and thus at some level understand our essential creaturely entanglement with other animals. This is what troubled Deleuze. Deleuze infamously said that the stupidest sound in nature is the dog barking. And he preferred to collect cats, even though he had this whole thing about domesticated animals. But the very fact that it troubles him, I suspect, makes it like a baby would trouble us. It's an expression that we have to it wouldn't trouble us if we didn't recognize the subjectivity in it. So this perspective pushes Mladen Dolar's statement, who's written he's one of the more famous people writing on the voice now. The voice is the element which ties the subject and the other together without belonging to either. And this pushes it beyond the inhuman discourse of Lacanian theory, which ultimately and rather ironically perpetuates kind of humanistic narcissism, even though it's all about the alien. It's about within the human, to include the non-human experience of the animal realm. Minelli writes that, and I don't know if I'm saying that name right, for those sympathetically attuned to the creaturely voice, quote, community begins in and remains symbolically organized around a communicativity that is passionate before it is rational, passive before it is willed. The initial condition of social identity is a recognition of creaturely substitutability. So this connects to seriality and the ready-made, that our sympathy, the possibility of empathy with other creatures comes through an understanding of substitutability, and I'm sure we'll talk about that together later. So the claim nestled within the very term creaturely voice, and that I'm going to unpack a little, is this. Many animals have the capacity for voice, which is not merely an evolutionary expedient to find mates, scare enemies, or communicate food sources, but is also a sonic exploration of ontological conditions. It is a way of testing the world and one's location, role, and value in it. In other words, monkeys, birds, whales, and so on test their own existence and relationship with the world through vocalizations, sometimes in similar way to ourselves, in ways that are at once phatic, banal, and miraculous. They are the non-symbolic equivalents of, I'm here, where are you? Are you really there? Who are you? Fort Da, Marco Polo. These are the unspoken and yet at least partially communicated messages woven into the ever-vanishing, yet always returning, medium of the voice. We must be careful, however, not to simply reinvent a naive metaphysics of presence for the animal kingdom, the kind of thinking so deftly deconstructed by Derrida, in which the voice is traditionally understood as the sign of the facticity and singularity of this or that being. What we symptomatically described in the transcendent singular, the voice, is in fact too slippery and complex to be the foundation of logocentric authority, which is to say, the sovereign decanting of incantations from the larynx into the book via the ink pot. Not the voice then, but a global choir of interwoven voices with Neoplatonic sonic model, with no Neoplatonic sonic model. Derrida's late work exposes Western culture's blinkered thinking about creatures other than ourselves by coining a new term, animal, hybrid of animal and word, orally implying an appreciation of the plural nature of, well, nature. We might do something similar here and coin a punning phrase, voila, which would be V-O-I-X, a term which underscores the always provisional, here it is, aspect of the voice, its deictic nature. Now you hear it, now you don't. You can never be sure of the true source, and you can never be sure of what it signifies, even as you may feel you understand the signal within the noise. As Dolar and others have suggested, there's something acousmatic about all voices, and the acousmatic voice is the voice that you can't see its source. So there's something uncanny about voices. Even if you see someone like me talking now, I could be ventriloquizing something. There's something metaphysically weird about it. Indeed, the voice or other voices complicate the cybernetic distinction between signal and noise, going beyond diagrammable models of communication into more obscure modes of existential exchange or mutual refusal to exchange. The medium is absolutely the message when it comes to asymbolic forms of sympathy. Take, for instance, the parrot or cockatoo. We humans have been fascinated by these birds largely by virtue of their perceived organic capacity to record our own voices and throw these back at us, like trickster ventriloquists long before the invention of phonography. Certainly, this can create an uncanny effect in the human listener, hearing our own voice echoed back from the larynx of a creature so different from ourselves, a creature that may or may not have its own mind or soul. Historically speaking, many people who had their figurative feathers ruffled by the impertinence of parrots deflected the discomfort they felt upon hearing their own words screeched back at them, either through laughter or with dismissive reference to the rather dumb mechanics of mimesis, of imitation. Parrots are like children, they would claim, squawking back syllables they don't comprehend. One might as well yell into a cave, they may further opine, and be astonished by the word's return. Such phenomena is simply nature in action, one physics, the other biology. But what if mimesis is a type of speech rather than just a sonic reflex? And here indeed we are slipping from voice to speech, from sonic event to vocal expression. The Marco Polo dynamic often found between beings may indeed be a kind of worlding refrain, a transductive reconnaissance mission that brings a relationship into being, and thus counts as a type of ontological experimentation, which in turn signifies the presence of a monad worthy of respect. Consider how the child or the lover playfully imitates the speech of the other. In doing so, he or she asserts their own identity while also putting such an identity under erasure. of both people. Many animals, including humans, may thus be creatures who continue to flesh themselves out into the world long after the first fall into identity, or at least a sense of self, through vocal back and forth with others and with the environment. We might consider this process as something akin to an acoustic version of an ongoing mirror stage, staged with and through contingent yet essential avatars of alterity. Even for animals that fail the so-called mirror test with all its anthropocentric assumptions. Here I am, where I am not, where you are not. Deleuze and Guattari called such mimetic exchanges between beings a refrain, a mode of expression which draws a territory, in some sense, always virtual. Bird songs, according to such a concept, create a refrain which in turn generates a territory through the act of sonically diagramming it. This operation is not limited to the natural world, however, since we may say the same about television sets or saxophones or microphones. We call a refrain, quote, any aggregate of matters of expression that draws a territory and develops into territorial motifs and landscapes. There are optical, gestural, motors, etc. refrains. Thus the refrain may assume other functions than boundary marking, amorous, professional, or social, liturgical, or cosmic. It always carries the earth with it, end quote. Moreover, in a striking observation that would appall many art historians, although not Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, not only does art not wait for human beings to begin, but we may ask if art ever appears among human beings except under artificial and belated conditions, end quote. And I myself am just tempted to simply replace the word art here with voice even. So in order to get a better grasp on the concept of creaturely voice and its non-humanist import, I'd like to look at two viral videos from YouTube. The first is called A Parrot Who Has Seen a Porn Movie and features a pet lovebird who has clearly been in the same room on more than one occasion while its owner is watching X-rated material. Oh, it's asking me to video converter? No, that's not what I want, is it? Should I have just told it to do VLC or something? Yeah, that's better. Okay, so you get the idea. It is, I'm pretty sure this is faked, but I'll get to that. So, see, this affect is a big part of it, right? So the instant mirth and or discomfort that this clip produces is a function of human misrecognition. And it is precisely this amusing discomfort that made the video such a viral hit, as we tend to find the frisson of affective dissonance, as opposed to cognitive dissonance, addictive in its disorienting force. The chances are high, in fact, that this clip is faked. You can read the endless comments on people trying to say why and how. There is something too perfect about the audio. Nevertheless, the visuals of the parrot matched with the audio track of exaggerated orgasms obliges us to endure the semiotic violence of self-recontextualization. Salacious sounds, which by all rights should be coming out of our aroused selves or an enthusiastic lover, are being rebroadcast back to us by an entity which has no sense of irony or decorum. It is literally obscene. It is as if the world were engaged in an objective parody of the planet's most arrogant animal, revealing one of our most sacred activities, making love, to be little more than a kind of crude ventriloquial trick. Seeing orgasmic pleasure unconsciously simulated in this way reminds us of the porn star, who, when viewed through the unvaselined lens, is little more than a caricatured reflection of our own erotic desires. The creaturely voice, which is already found in the overly exuberant porn star, or woefully inadequate orgasm faker, becomes all the more insulting and or amusing when made explicit, as it were, in the guise of a small bird. This parrot is not deliberately lampooning us, as a college roommate might do, trying to shame their co-tenant for the latter's active sex life by imitating the beastly noises it creates on the other side of the wall. And yet, the refrain created by the bird's mimetic tendencies means that we are lampooned nevertheless. There is no escaping or denying the parodic power of the animal, no matter how mediated or manipulated. So, my second example, if I can be coordinated enough. So, cockatoo. This is Peaches the cockatoo mimicking a couple arguing, is almost certainly not faked, and as the title suggests, concerns a pet bird which was given to a new couple after a bitter divorce, obliged it to find a new home. The details of the breakup remain obscure to the second owners. However, the overwhelmingly negative emotional climate of the life which led up to this separation has been preserved in the probably traumatized mind of the bird. In short, this cockatoo reenacts the tone, pitch, and vehemence of the arguments that it was obliged to witness in a previous life. So while only some of the words, the cockatoo screeches are not, while only some of the words are clear enough to be understood, shut the fuck up and for God's sake is definitely in there. The emotions which initially launched them are obvious to all within hearing distance. Curse words pour out of the poor bird in the tenor of an embittered middle-aged woman filled to the brim with resentment. The bird even bobs its head and springs its wings in imitation of the angry body language of a wife scorned, spurned, or otherwise so aggrieved that she can only incessantly shriek at the man who made her so miserable. The viewer is caught off guard by this virtuoso performance in which there is no room for artistic interpretation, only another rebroadcasting of this violent domestic refrain. Once again, a lurching oscillation between laughter and discomfort is the human response to the oral portrait of humanity exposed in this voice, somehow both acousmatic and not. We do not see the source of this voice, and yet we can imagine her vividly. And yet the voice is also the bird's voice, who we can see. Whose voice is this, then? As Dolar claims, it belongs to neither subject nor object, but is suspended between them. Whether we call this modest but highly charged sonic event an instance of the refrain, the oral punctum, which is something I developed elsewhere, the voice of nature, the voila, or the ecological voice, it creates a troubling frisson in the viewer because it deconstructs the cherished metaphysics of humanist presence far more and economically and effectively than Derrida does in his writings. This parrot and this cockatoo are trapped in their own mimetic inhibitors, held captive by the seduction of the sound which re-territorialized their bodies, organs, instincts. But such a process only serves to strongly imply that we ourselves are similarly trapped when we are in the ecstatic, agonistic throes of jouissance or fury. The creaturely voice democratizes the ontological condition of all beings, slicing through the pretensions of human culture, so-called logos, to be the exception that matters when it comes to the expression of suffering or of pleasure, which, as we know, can sound very similar. So, as a final example, consider one famous instance of simulated human suffering, devolving into a creaturely register, namely the old professor, literature professor, Dr. Emanuel Roth, who experiences a nervous breakdown when he succumbs to intense jealousy and a broken heart at the climax of Joseph von Sternberg's classic film, The Blue Angel, from 1930. And I'll just show about 4 minutes of that. Sorry. So, for those who haven't seen it,
Gentlemen, self to two.
Yes, the professor falls in love with Marlene Dietrich. It's a story of high pathos. He ends up on stage as a clown and then finds out at that moment that, well, he finds out just before he goes on stage that she's not in love with him, and then he finds out, even worse, that she's kissing another man. Yes.
Would you leave you for me? Why, of course, Director, of course I can, with great pleasure. My dear ladies and gentlemen, I will now permit myself to extract a few eggs from the nose of... My August. Gather your wits together, August. That you were once a professor. Perhaps you are under the impression that August has the eggs hidden in his head. Right, wrong. Another picture. Very good, ladies and gentlemen. At once, our motto is prompt service. 1, 2, 3. An egg. Where's your key, man? An egg. A good fresh-laid egg. Please. If you don't close this time, I'll braid you. Once more. 1, 2, 3. An egg. We sing it. It's a real good, fresh-laid egg. Hello. Kick-a-key. You're kicking-a-key. Kick-a-key, man. Or I'll break your neck. Kick-a-key. 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 Kick-a-key, you idiot.
So just as the full weight of his rejection at the hands of Lola Lola is being registered in his psyche, the professor, who has quit teaching to follow his beloved in the cabaret world, as you saw, is ushered out into the stage. The audience wait in skeptical anticipation of an amusing performance, but the haunted ex-professor can only unleash a torrent of repressed anguish at his broken heart and his humiliation at the hands of the vulgar mob. The horrible sound he releases, silencing the crowd, is part spurned lover, part rooster, and wholly abject. This sound would truly be one of the worst ringtones imaginable. The professor seems to lose almost all his humanity, which was once verifiable in his composed and authoritative teaching voice, but is now some kind of demonic bird screeching in misery, fury, and defeat. As the seemingly mindless force of vengeance tries to strangle his romantic obsession backstage, and as he continues to struggle against those who restrain him, the ex-professor has become creaturely, a supposedly subhuman status signified more by his inhuman voice than by anything else. And yet, as we have seen, the creaturely voice of an actual cockatoo can be mimicking the animalistic affect of a human being. There is simply no hierarchy here where the animal occasionally, in times of great distress, finds themselves reduced to being an animal, where the human occasionally finds themselves reduced to being an animal. The creaturely voice can be sweet, like a nightingale, or it can be harsh, like the traumatized cockatoo or the green-eyed Professor Clown. As such, it is the actual manifestation of what some heretical scholastic philosophers called the univocity of being. Univocity describing the shared immanent ontology of all existence, so that being, capital Being, is sung through all beings equally and in a single yet distributed voice. We might call this the vox mundi, the voice of the world. But to explore such concepts and relations between them properly, we need a different forum, and so just for today, I'm saying it should suffice to anticipate an intimate link between the voices of animals and those of humans, which cannot be reduced to a concept like communication, but which nevertheless impacts and influences all those in hearing distance, that is, unless one happens to be a whale singing at 52 hertz, in which case we are likely to keep singing into the inky darkness without any reply whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we're having a Q&A, and I'd rather have, if there are any questions, to start with the audience. Otherwise, I have also one or two.
I guess I can ask a question to one. About the first talk, what really interested me was this relationship in pedagogy in France, I guess, specifically between animality and literality in a way. I mean, there were a lot of references thrown throughout, but I don't remember hearing that basic Aristotelian notion that we are, humans are the zoon logon echon, the animal that can speak. Because if in modernity or any time basically to be human means that we need to use language, that we need to speak, and then also on a higher level also to be able to write, then I'm wondering what is happening in the movement of education in modernity, not only on the level of teaching everybody universal literacy, but some kind of inability to teach us animalacy. I don't know. It's some kind of animal literacy as a way, because it seems as if it's not just to be human from an Aristotelian point of view. It doesn't only mean that I need to be able to speak, but also that I need to be able to be an animal, which is not something that is so much given the fact that in modernity we're separated almost from all animals. And it seems to me that my animalacy, my animal literacy comes from my school years. I don't see so many animals, and we don't see so many animals in modern urban life. So my question is about this animal literacy. And to the second talk, I just think that also human expression is not so simple. And I heard some attempts to speak about that question of pain and the expression of pain. And it always seems as if the Wittgensteinian metaphor from the investigations is lost, because it seems so basic there to realize that what does it mean to express the fact that when I say I'm in pain is not that simple. And I think that if you understand that, maybe we could also move towards an understanding of what does it mean for an animal to express pain, because it's actually not that different from his perspective. Thanks.
I mean, I rather like this idea of teaching animality. What that would mean, I don't know, but it's kind of interesting. It reminds me, this is on a different register, a darker register, but in a recent book by François Leruel, A General History of Victimhood, he talks about the 20th century being the century of crimes against humanity, and that the 21st may turn out to be the crimes against animality. So that had something to do with what you're talking, though, of course, on a much darker register. What it would mean to teach animality, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it happens. I think it's slowly changing, maybe not in the official discourse, but animality itself is becoming a concept even in popular discourse. And then just, I don't know how else to answer that question other than going back to Aristotle. There's a really wonderful book by George Steiner called Anthropocentrism and Its Discontent, which traces a really beautiful history of philosophy's relationship to animals. And it's not like a line, a line of straight debasement. If you go back to the Greeks and even Aristotle, I mean, Aristotle's nowhere near what Descartes is going to say about animals. I mean, if you read Aristotle, he has a better understanding of what animals actually are than, let's say, the moderns do, let's say Descartes. So it's more of a reverse U-shape. So I think there's something too going back to the Greeks, Empedocles, and some of these Greek thinkers that seem to be much more, I mean, like Derrida said, they may have seen themselves being seen by the animal rather than, not even occurring to them that an animal could see them. So that's another way of answering that question. I don't know if that satisfies you, but I think you're right to bring up Aristotle, because this history is, the low point for animals seems to be, at the beginning of modern thought, and then we're still kind of at a low point, to be honest, but hopefully it's going up.
Yeah, and that's helpful, because I'm just really starting to. This is fresh material. It's not like I've really decided what I'm saying yet. I only started writing this project a few weeks ago, so that's a really helpful reference, the Wittgenstein one, because yes, that's a case where it's not that there is a definitive break in terms of understanding. Obviously, when we're trying to express that we're in pain, say to a doctor, we all know that it's easier to do that with somebody in our own language, obviously. It's a kind of relief to have some nuances of communication, but we also know difference and asymptotes and all the rest of it. So, and in animal studies, Wittgenstein comes up every day for the bon mot about the lion. If the lion could speak, we wouldn't understand what it was saying. But what I think you were trying to do is flip that a little bit and say, do we know what we're even saying now? We might even be talking at cross purposes. I mean, Q&As are classic examples where people just say whatever's in their head, and then the ships pass in the night. So in that sense, I think it helps. I think you're helping me make my argument that there's much more of a spectrum and overlaps, and it is to do with affect and expression, or attempts at expression, and sympathy rather than substitutability rather than, communicational models. So thank you for that reference.
Sort of have a question when it comes to substitutability and the animal world when it meets the art world. And this in reference to animal blood, and copious amounts of like animal blood that's used in as substituting for human blood, let's say Herman Nietzsche, ritualized, you know. I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on that, just philosophically.
On the Vienna Actionists?
Yeah, or just substitutability of
Okay, yeah.
that.
And I think this was something that came up in your talk, which was really nice, a really nice way to talk about this. I mean, for me, I guess like the 60s, I mean, this is going to sound like very art historical and very un-aesthete of me, but I find most of the work done with animals in the 60s to be completely uncritical and like atavistic and, you know, suspending any ethical consideration for aesthetics. You know, it's like a reverse Kierkegaardian situation of suspending the ethical for ethics. So I don't know, like Otto Muhl and Herman Nietzsche and that stuff. I mean, it doesn't resonate with me so much. It feels very old. It's only in the 70s, I think, where you start seeing artists incorporate animals in ways that actually are ecologically sound. And you know, it's never clear and cut. Ethics are never clear cut, but you definitely have more of a sense of them being a performer in the work rather than just an object to sacrifice, right? So maybe the Abrahamic tradition starts to shift in the 70s. But of course, it's all highly disjunctive. I mean, because you have, you know, all sorts of work being done today that might be described that way. Substitutability, I thought, was really interesting, and this is where, I mean, you know, one of the key lessons of like a Derridian kind of thinking, or like Jean-Luc Nancy, is that especially when you're dealing with the animal, you're limited. The language limits you. I mean, one of the things I was trying to convey is that, you know, biopolitics and our way of engaging the world ethopolitically, there are ethological limits. There are ethological limits imposed on us. The way we can't get outside of our human animality to engage these questions. This is the same thing with language. It's very, very hard to represent these situations or to convey properly this non-human form of being through language. But that's really the only way I can communicate with you. I mean, not the only way, but in a Q&A like this, it's the only way. So it's that's very hard. So you have to be very exact with terms. And I don't know if I said substitutability or substitution. I may have, and I'd have to clarify. I think I'll be shorter. One way to clarify is to go back to that Benjamin quote from his mechanical reproduction essay that I quote right at the end, where he says he uses the word reproduction at the end as a way of like becoming a form of general equivalence. Like everything becomes flat. So like capitalism, currency, it flattens everything out. But reproduction in that sentence can be taken two ways, right? I mean, it can be reproduction in the way he's talking about it, where everything becomes identical, which you would say is more like generality, like making identical things, like serialization and that sort of thing. But then, of course, reproduction within a more mammalian, animal, human way, that's not it, right? I mean, even when you clone something, you're not making something identical once it enters its own being within time, space, sentience, and memory, right? So like we keep making babies and babies and babies. We would never call that mechanical reproduction in the way Benjamin's using it, but we do call it reproduction. But it doesn't mean that those things that are reproduced, whether it's a chicken or a baby or a cow, now muscles get a little trickier, but you're making inimitable repetitions. It's not sameness. I mean, that's the way I'm trying to think of it, right? Because we have to make a difference between the repetition of something we consider to be life and irreplaceable, and things that we don't consider, that like urinals or this glass. Like it is substitutable. It is more or less purely replaceable. And I find that to have a lot of consequences both in art but also in ethics and in politics. Does that answer the question more? I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was just curious about your thoughts, but then you were asking what makes art art, and then you alluded to an infernal space, and I thought perhaps what makes art art is that it has the capacity to be an infernal space.
Yeah, and that's nice because I mean, the way I'm using the ready-made, it's bleeding into, nominal forms of power in politics and culture. Like the way I'm reading it is that the power of the ready-made, or at least the power the ready-made elicits, is the power to name something art. And we all know that has a lot of power. But there are other discursive formats in culture and politics. Someone can be, named or nominated anything if they don't have the power to change the way they're nominated. And animals, they're the weakest and the most vulnerable among us. And they can't do anything. There's nothing they can say about the way they're nominated. So whether or not they're nominated as art, as food, as entertainment, or as a pet, a loved one, it matters a lot. And I see a parallel with the ready-made and that ethical political dimension of naming.
I guess I have a question. This is working. Yes. I was thinking, I guess, to also do both discussions about space. I was thinking, what does an animal see when it's put inside a white cube? In the sense that his whole Umwelt, his environment is completely killed, let's say, and it's in a way worse than a room in a zoo.
It's another form of domestication in a way.
It's like
more
the complete cut of the senses. I was also thinking about the whales, how you were speaking about the perimeter of whales being reduced because of industry and the trauma that's imposed on animals. And this question of trauma to me was kind of interesting and kind of in both discussions. I was wondering, in terms of art, for example, you were talking about the ready-made, which is a gesture of inclusion, and at a moment when the rate of extinction of animals is the biggest since the dinosaurs.
Sure, yeah.
What to make of instead of inclusion, expansion or repopulation, or this kind of gesture in relation to space, to bring in or to accelerate outside. I don't know if I'm making myself clear here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can talk a little about the gallery space because it's very interesting to think about it within the history of domestication. But the gallery as a place of immunity, right? And for some humans and some non-humans, it's a very safe, good, prosperous place of immunity. And sometimes it might not be. And so I'm actually thinking of an early example. Rose Finn Kelsey, she did a performance in the 70s. This would really interest you in the talk if you don't know about this work. It was called One for Sorrow, Two for Joy. And I like to think of it as the gendered counterpart to Boyce's more like shamanistic male performance in the 70s. She was in a gallery with a magpie. And she was performing and trying to teach the magpie this song, One for Sorrow, Two for Joy, which I think is a very famous Welsh song. And when you were asking about the white space and the gallery and what that does, back then in the 70s, I'm sure everyone just thought, oh, this is like a feminist work, and this is kind of, like it's a little, it was, let's say, pigeonholed in a certain way. But now, of course, we know the Corbett family, crows and magpies. I mean, they're very, very highly intelligent, and they also can reproduce the voice. Some in the Corbett family. So then the work historically starts to change. It starts to change, and now all of a sudden, that magpie becomes more of a performer. But I wonder what it was. I mean, this is like the essence of what we try to do in some ways. Like, well, I get inside the head of a non-human. I don't know what it would have known. How to be a bat. Yeah, what it's like to be a bat, right? The famous essay. But we do know what it's like to be an artist, and we do know what it's like to be an art historian. We do know what it's like to be kind of confined. So, can we parlay that over to an understanding of how being confined within an animal body and a performance? I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't thought enough about space, other than that it would be like that we are kind of creating types of solitary confinement because we think of a creature in the ocean as having limitless freedom because we think of space as movements of bodies. I mean, maybe because we think of the body in movement rather than as these networks of community through sound. So it is an inability, like it takes scientists, so even if we don't know how they think, it's actually, thanks to technologies and science and things like that, we can simulate, approximate, speculate enough to realize that, like, maybe this is what we're doing violence, sonic violence to these creatures that wouldn't have occurred to us before because we wouldn't have thought about their Umwelt.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, wild space is, a lot of people work on this, but wild space is kind of fascinating, especially in the Anthropocene, because now you have, wild animals that are being quasi-trained to do certain things and not others. A classic example are condors, who are taught not to land in certain places, like on electrical fences, in order to keep them going, right? So working with endangered wild animals, but they're they're only quasi-wild now in some ways, right? Or at least the Anthropocene has encircled the whole thing in a much larger network of human intervention.
Actually, you remind me, this does go on towards Murray Schafer's Soundscapes, which was a big book in the 70s, a kind of romantic attempt to sort of salvage positive sounds and make unpleasant sounds extinct. And it wasn't just a human endeavor, it was about working with all creatures to make a more pleasant soundscape for us all to live inside. And obviously in New York, we haven't managed to do that yet, by a long shot.
And topographically, there's a really beautiful example in, I think it's Washington State. They've started making overpasses over the highway that look like, something from a science fiction film. It's this whole overpass that's natural, right? It looks very organic, so that animals can go over. So that would be kind of like a post-humanist form of urban planning, right? What's that? Rewilding, yeah.
I think there's a lot of animals that are like. I think there's a lot of animals that don't have a problem with. There's definitely animals that would view, for example, the gallery space as a realm of imprisonment, like a coyote or something like that. But that gallery, this gallery, are probably surrounded by animals right now. There's probably animals in all the walls.
Oh yeah.
There's probably animals, and they don't seem to mind.
Yeah.
And we've done, and their relationship to the Anthropocene is not this specifically antagonistic one. They're not as interesting as condors, but they're kind of formed a relationship with us that's similar, I guess, to they're not fully, I wouldn't call them wild, but the cockroaches are definitely doing fine.
Yeah. And some animals are going to do much, much better in the future, right?
Yeah, so I just wanted to put that in there and see where that went.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And you're reminding, another talk I would have wanted to give, my talk seemed very much based on negative rights in some ways, if we're talking about rights, what not to do. But I think what would be more fruitful going forward is just talking about positive rights. Like, what is it that animals, fellow denizens, maybe even call them co-citizens, how is it that they contribute to the urban, to the quasi-urban, to the rural? How is it that they actually, they contribute to life, to the world? And there's a wonderful book. I think it's it's the biggest advance in animal rights theory that I've read in a while. It's called Zoopolis. I forget. I'm terrible with names. I forget Sue Donaldson and Will Klemica. Zoopolis, and it's an animal rights-based theory, but based on positive rights. What animals can do, and what they already do offer as denizens. So cockroaches, mice, rats. Rats are fascinating in this city, along with everything else. Right? It is the way you describe it is right. It is there's non-human activity all over the place. It is happening, and they are contributing as shared denizens of the city of the world. Right? So I think that's a really important comment to make.
Agreed.
Is there any other question? Otherwise, we might keep it here.
The air conditioning died, I think.
Thank you
Yeah,
for
definitely.
coming.